world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today's topic is corporate culture. What works, what doesn't, what needs to change, and how. We're joined by three extremely qualified guests to dig into this hairy topic. Duena Blomstrom is the author of Emotional Banking, a book looking at culture in banking specifically. Sharon O'Dea is the former head of digital communications at Standard Chartered and current communications strategy consultant. Alessandro Hatami is the former group digital director at Lloyds Bank and currently advises Tier 1 banks on digital solutions. This conversation was a bit experimental in terms of both format and subject. Let us know what you think about the group discussion. I'm not sure we reached a conclusion, per se, dealing with a topic as broad as culture, but I think we surfaced some interesting considerations. What did we miss? Let us know on Twitter at Rebank Podcast or by email at will.beeson@bankingthefuture.com. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please welcome Duena Blomstrom, Sharon O'Dea, and Alessandro Hatami. All right, Alessandro, Duena, and Sharon, welcome to Rebank.
Thank you for having us.
So we're going to try something interesting with a mere two microphones and four of us. So we'll all do our best to sit close to the mic when it's our turn to record. And not only that, we're going to discuss a potentially tricky topic of culture. Potentially overplayed, potentially underplayed. It gets a lot of talk, but we never really get to the core. And so I'm feeling we can cover it today because we have three such excellent and experienced guests among our ranks. Duena, who recently wrote a book on culture in banking. So if there were ever an authority, I think she's sitting here with us. So culture in banking, okay. Financial crisis, we've already, we've been over that for years now. It kind of feels like it's different maybe, but probably not much. A lot of attention's been paid to it. Then kind of tech came along, new, culture, new everything was gonna work, swimmingly. Then the Uber thing happened, and recently Facebook data breach, and maybe there was, I guess it wasn't really even a breach, was it? Just kind of a poor, yeah, exactly, bad practices, right? Which all, I guess, links back to culture at the end of the day, doesn't it? So it's clearly a much bigger problem than banking. But Duena, from your standpoint, culture in banking, culture in business, culture in tech. Set the stage for us.
Right. I think it's a very difficult point to start at, in fact, because culture means different things to different people. It's also, I've come to realize, a rather dirty word in banking these days. People don't want to approach it with that name for those reasons. So the way you've described it right now, to me, that almost sounds like the press exception of understanding of the word culture, which is kind of, is there a culture of sales? Is there a culture of bullying? Is there a culture of... So we've used this as an adjective to various behaviors in an organization. And in particular, and they get attention in the press when they are negative behaviors. Of course, there's not going to be, is there a culture of innovation and brotherhood? That's not the type of press that we want to talk about. So essentially, it's become a negative connotation to behaviors in organizations that we want to highlight. In banking, I think it's even worse than that. We don't even talk about culture whatsoever. When we do, it's typically, should we get another intranet or shall we redo the remuneration package? Whereas to me, it's none of those things. In a way, referring to culture that way in banking is the same type of misconception of the soul of the word as it is not understanding what brand is and thinking brand is marketing. It's the same problem. Culture to me is everything that embodies the way that those people work together and make things together. And in banking, I think it's a lot more complicated in other industries. Maybe we'll touch on this later. It's because we are at the intersection of several very important themes, right? There's money, there's yourself as a consumer involved in it. There's all this exception of understanding of regulations and all the constraints we seem to have, and then there's technology. And the intersection of all these things makes it for a very different organizational soul than other types of organizations, in my mind. So I think we need to do that. Let's do that. Let's figure out what does culture mean to each of you. I already heard your answer to a degree, so I'm really curious how you guys define it, because I've heard so many definitions over the last few weeks at least that it's interesting.
Should I pick that one up? So these days I run a small digital communications consultancy, so I work with large firms, including banks and actually some small startups as well, on how they collaborate and the technologies that they use to do that. In my previous life, I was head of digital communications for a global bank, where we looked at exactly that, actually what tools can we bring in to help people to collaborate and work better together. But there was an over-focus on technology quite a lot of the time. And actually, in order to get people working better together, you need to focus on the culture. So there is a culture of collaboration, of creating, and of understanding customer problems in different ways. So for me, culture, and in particular in banking, is actually the DNA of your organisation. It's your values, it's how you do things, it's what you believe. And that reflects in the brand as well. It's what do we look like, what do we feel like? That's the culture of any large organisation.
Alessandro, what do you think?
Well, as an ex-banker, I can say that I agree in part. So I'll be political at this. I think there is an opportunity for banks to change their culture to be more focused on on what they do and how the customers operate and how they engage with customers. I think when I was delighted, Duena, when you decided to write a book on emotional banking, because it is a fundamental dimension that people seem to be missing about how people make financial decisions. And there's an assumption in larger financial organizations that the decision is entirely rational, or it's driven by simple things like color schemes or how easy it is to open an application and so on. I think there's a lot more layers underneath that, and I think what your approach of thinking about what drives these sales is a really profound changing point that I think banks need to be considering. And I think it goes, culture is one dimension of it, but it is also changing the mindset of the banker, focusing on the consumer and focusing on what their outcome is. And
precisely what I mean by culture. I may have chosen the wrong word for it, I'm starting to believe.
Well, I don't want to play, not devil's advocate, but I do want to ask some questions that hopefully cut through a lot of this like high level generic talk around culture, because I think we've probably all heard tons of it. But so, okay, if I think about a company like Patagonia, right, like, and they're kind of like the poster child for like good culture. So there's like sustainability through their production, and then they run like, I don't know, they donate whatever percentage of profits to environmental, reconstitution or whatever.
They
and
are part of Patagonia themselves also.
Yeah. Banks aren't in the business of making warm, fuzzy sweaters. They are in the business of making money. They're in the business, to an extent, of helping their customers make money. They're in the business of money. So how does culture, which I think we're broadly saying is like doing things with the right values, doing things for the right reasons, how does that fit with a bottom line focused return on investment approach to borrowing and lending money?
Thank you for that question.
Does it?
It absolutely does. Let's unpack this again, right? So let's see how did I even arrive at culture from my perspective, right? I came from a very hardcore technology background. I was making products with a company doing data-driven products, right? I've seen a lot of digital transformations of a lot of banks. I've seen what's missing. I've seen what the consumer was aching for. And I came up with the idea that we have to start looking at the way the consumers feel about their money. So that was, the title of emotional banking was that. It's not possible to attempt, and in fact, it's not only, it's possible, but it's very undesirable to attempt to be making products and not money moments, to attempt to be thinking of financial services and not the way that money flows into someone's life, and to have no understanding or regard for people's exact feelings about their money. That's the concept started from there, when I realized that's not acceptable. At first I thought, surely banks are doing this, I just don't know about it. Surely there's like these secret labs where they talk about people's feelings and then they make a product. That's how we ended up with our current account. Evidently that's wrong. So there was no conversation on the market. There was no behavioral psychology involved in it. This was 6-7 years ago. None of that. So I left the technology conversation so that I changed this. And when I went to change it, at first I was naive enough to think I'm going to waltz into a boardroom, I'm going to tell a CEO that what they're doing is wrong, they should think about people's feelings, because more people remain with a bank than remain married in this country, and they should start investigating their feelings, then they can make money moments. And then I realized that approach is not going to change much, let's put it elegantly, because just telling someone that emotional banking exists and you should investigate people's feelings and you should become a design-led organization and you should work in a different way changes nothing. So my next reality was, I have to find a way, if I'm serious that this is a problem and they need to start doing this for real, then I have to find a way that they can change that, and I have to find it quickly. And the way that they can, there's no technology out there that's going to make them change that. There's no using of magical fintech bullets that's going to help them change that. The only thing that's going to help them change that is if they change the mindset of the people within the bank. So that's my approach, was very product driven. I need something quick to help these big things. It won't be a new sustainability program or throwing all your paper from the office. It has to be things that really matter. And to me, and I'll finish it, the levers that I found and that worked in these workshops and so on are aimed to change very fundamentally human things, are aimed to increase passion in their bankers, they're aimed to increase knowledge in their bankers, they're aimed to make them speak English to each other and not consultancy speak, and to keep them honest. So if they manage those things internally, then you'll see less of the bro culture, less of the Uber issues, less of the sell and make products only type of issues. So I thought, if you can start changing those important levers, then you can have a hope to start using technology and change your proposition to consumer. That's the long story of it. Okay,
and how does that translate into bottom line for a traditional bank?
In the way Alessandro showed it. If you start figuring out how to become that type of a product, not a product, how to become that type of a emotional connection with a brand, then you're going to start saving money.
I would probably pick up on that and say banks are well aware that they are being challenged by all manner of other players. So they are having to change the way that they produce, that they identify products, that they connect with customers. And that requires them to change their culture. And that requires, they need to change their culture in order to innovate and to speed up. So there is a real need to, in order to be, I suppose it's an existential crisis. If banks don't change their culture, they won't exist.
But aren't banks going to become these dumb pipes, like the utility layer anyway? And big tech is going to come in and own all the customer relationships?
Well, that's one theory, and some people have been talking about that in the past. I think what ultimately, the point that Duena is making is not that the banks have never had this concentration, this focus on the customer, is that they've forgotten about it. If you think about the banker in the 12th century Genoa trying to sell to this merchant that wanted to get money to go buy silk in China, they were thinking about outcomes, they were thinking about the need of the customer, and they were thinking about a segment of one. What happened with industrialization of financial products is it became, you started to have to make standard mass-produced products, and these became the financial product that customers are currently buying. Today, with technology, we're realizing that you could go back to a segment of one in the product that you manufacture. So in order to do that, you have to create a product that is entirely fitting to the outcome that the customer has, because nobody wakes up in the morning dreaming of credit cards and mortgages. They're thinking about holidays and homes. And the bank needs to go back to have that conversation so that the bank becomes your port of call when you have a complicated financial question or you have an issue to resolve, not a store that you go and buy products and caveat emptor, if you make a mistake, it's your problem, not mine. And I think it requires culture change, but it's not as scary as it could sound. It requires just thinking slightly differently, adding extra levers to your product design. And think about outcome, think about customer need, think about things that are relevant to your customer way beyond price and how many bells and how many whistles you have on your product.
I'd be curious if people had examples of companies that they think have particularly good culture. Not banks, like in the industry.
I do. Some of them are in the book. But they're not in the industry. I don't really have great examples at all in the industry. So, and the correlation I've made to brand comes from the examples, essentially. Because if you look at people like JetBlue, for instance, one of the examples, which is an airline I'm sure you're familiar with. If you look at Ted Baker, I probably should start charging them for just mentioning them. Just if you look at the thing that they put out and the connection they have with their client, and then you go back through that thread and you look at internally, are they feeling that same way? Do they have that DNA, that soul that allowed them to think of the emotional connection at the other end? Then you'll see that they all do. They all have it. And in fact, there's a banking example I do give sometimes. They're not a client, and of course the banks I worked with are going to be first soon, but until that happens, a banking example I give a lot, and you guys would have heard that story, is DBS, who has done a very serious cultural change before they started on IT. So the CEO's idea was, we're not doing any of this IT stuff until we clean house and we get the right fundamentals in place.
So for the DBS example, sorry, real quick, is the idea that by correcting the culture internally, they can be better at
deploying technology. Yes.
Better at deploying technology.
Yes.
So it's not about being nicer to customers.
No, it's not
about. It's about running a more efficient business because your people work better.
Products. Let's face it. I mean, none of this is necessarily so that they get nicer to consumers. This is literally so that they put out a much better digital experience that keeps them in the game and they don't become dumb pipes.
Yeah. So like making decisions, working in teams, like that sort of stuff.
I think that the concept of being nice to your customer, and I'll be controversial here, is not that important. I think you need to give your customer what the customer wants and how they want it and when they do it. If the customer wants niceness, you got to give them niceness. If they want a really good priced product that is easy to buy, that makes sense to them when they need it, that's what you do. So, controversially, I think Uber it has a fantastic culture as far as the customer need is concerned, because they address it really well. They have done a lot of stupid decisions in the way they deliver this. But ultimately, you need a transportation. You think about pushing a few buttons on your phone and you get a car that takes you to wherever you need to go. It has all kinds of issues around how they've done this, but ultimately, as far as the customer is concerned, it's a pretty good product. Apple is another good one. Apple is present in every aspect of a lot of people's lives. I bought my first Apple product in the early noughties, and now everything tech digital I have is Apple. Why is it that it's Apple? It's because they've connected to every aspect of my life. And if I think, okay, I'm going to go Samsung soon, I think to myself, okay, what do I need to change? What different habits do I have to pick up to be able to do that? I love what the Samsung S9 looks like and all the features that it has, but when it comes to making my next buying decision, I am not sure that I will be courageous enough to actually take the step in that direction. And that's what this is all about. This is about thinking about me as a customer and making me think that they are delivering something that I want in a good way. The minute to deviate from that, I start thinking about going elsewhere.
No, it's almost easier to think about companies that have bad culture that we still willingly buy from than it is to think about companies with good culture and how that's a competitive advantage. I mean, if you think about like budget airlines, like raise your hand if you like budget airlines. Like everyone hates budget airlines, but they're so much cheaper than other options, so much more efficient that people
use them.
Example.
Compare Ryanair to EasyJet, though. Okay, a lot of people go to Ryanair even though it's got terrible service. They do it because it has one delivery capability, which is great. It goes to where you want to go, and it costs little. And so you put up with the fact that they route to you when you go there, and that you can be bumped easily, etc., etc. EasyJet is slightly better. They have created a more intelligent way of organizing themselves, but still, you're willing to give up a lot of things if you get delivered what you want. So the level of service that they started delivering when they came out was a lot inferior to what the airlines did, the traditional airlines did, but people went to them because they were fulfilling a need.
Well, this is what's quite an interesting point is, so Edelman do an annual survey, the Trust Barometer, And that's shown that, that trust in financial services organisations dropped like a stone in the financial crisis and has never recovered. Technology has been flying high, and this year it went on a dip. And the recent spate of scandals with Uber and say the current one with Facebook suggests that that will start to make a difference. Actually, people's purchasing decisions are partly based on how well a brand or an organisation aligns with their values, and there is a tipping point for a lot of people that says, I'm no longer prepared to deal with a company like this. Equally, while obviously the value proposition for any banking service or product will be the thing that people look to first, all things being equal, then they start to look at, is this a company that I'm happy giving my money to? Is this one that I feel is aligned with the work they do? So if you look at the growth of Smile in the UK, that's people who want to work with a slightly nicer bank, or one that's considered perhaps a bit less evil than some of the others. These things do make a difference, and in a market where a lot of the products are essentially the same, it's a differentiator.
Yeah, I think. May I pick it up? I think that's interesting. I think it's going to be very interesting to discuss the moral dimension of it. And I don't actually bring it in. This was nothing that I thought of or even touched in the book at all, because I just don't equate culture with what we use the term now as. But you said, all things being equal, should you have gotten to the digital level where you serve your customer in the right way, then I'll decide between Tesco or Sainsbury's on who gives more to the food bank. And they sell the exact same thing. There's no real difference. And I feel like they're doing their very best. I have some emotional connection with one of them. That is not the case in banking. We are so far behind doing our very best in terms of digital output that I think that whether someone's going to choose a bank on anything else but minor differences in that digital output is...
That's an interesting point.
So having worked for a bank that had a less than stellar reputation in that front, so during the time I was there, we had everything from funding the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef to breaking Iranian sanctions. Those are two of the public ones. And actually, the number of people who will close bank accounts on the back of a lot of that is surprisingly high. Actually, what's interesting on the back of some of those scandals and other ones in the financial crisis, like the LIBOR scandal, is banks are finally starting to look at culture, but usually just from the point of view of compliance. Let's stop being assholes. Right. And actually, I mean, at least they are starting to look at that. But fundamentally, it's not simply about telling people to do the right thing, but actually ensuring you've got the right processes and procedures in place to encourage people to do the right thing.
And the right people.
Yeah, and the right people. So actually, are people incentivized on sales? Rather than ensuring that we've got the right outcome for customers? Are people incentivized to do the kind of deals that maybe aren't aligned with a bank's value statement? That's when. So it is more about more than simply the fluffy stuff, but actually ensuring that the whole way the organisation is set up supports that better way of working.
These are massive publicly traded companies. So what do shareholders want these companies to do?
Shareholders want the value of their shares to go up.
So do they care about culture on the front end?
I think some do. If you're killing baby seals, yes, they would prefer not to invest in you. But by and large, if you're not doing things that are terribly illegal, if your shares increase in value, I'm happy with keeping my money with you. But I think ultimately what the point is that you will not be able to have my value go up if you start forgetting about what the bank was created for, which is serving the customer. So I think every one of us is starting now thinks about, or bankers traditionally, or large corporates traditionally, have been thinking very short term about revenue and profit and profitability and so on. It's the long term play that actually counts. And when something goes wrong, that's where the relationship you develop with the client makes a difference. Because when you're in trouble, that's when they stick with you because of the other metrics that you have generated for them. So all the big organizations these days seem to be thinking about shorter term profitability or shorter term revenues and so on and so forth. And some investors like that. But I think the vast majority of investors actually prefer a longer-term strategy that generates reliable, sustainable, long-term value. And I think that only comes if you center at the customer.
The reality of it is, my fight is in the hopes that I can turn the ship around for incumbent banks. That's why I've even started discussing this. If I thought it was only about money moments to consumers, then it's very likely that they wouldn't need to make any of these changes, and that maybe they have a profitability model to become a profitable pipe. Maybe the shareholders are still going to be happy. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is if you do these things, if you get more passion and more knowledge stat in, you can use your technology, you can deliver a digital experience that's going to keep that relationship, and you can play against the bigger players that already have that. They already have the brand, they already have the emotional connection with the consumer. And if they're not the big guys, they're the tiny guys that are now kind of by default apparently building it. Let's not discuss exact cases, but there are challengers that are building some brand capital. All of those things are going to matter. But if you don't care about it, you're only about share price, then it's very fine to be a dumb pipe if you can make money on that.
It's interesting. I think some of the big banks realize the importance of culture these days. Mm-hmm. If you just judge for that, the advertising that you're seeing on banks in the UK, if you look at how Lloyds has changed its positioning, if you look how Nationwide positioned itself, if you look how Barclays talks about all the good things they do for people and helping them interview, etc., they're all realizing that their product is seen as generic and as a commodity, and trying to differentiate on softer stuff. What will happen in a situation where your product is seen as generic in the extreme is that somebody will come in and aggregate your product in a cooler, more efficient way, and you'll be disintermediated. Now, as an organization, you may say, you know what, that's not that terrible. I just get rid of all my front-end staff, and I don't have a website anymore. Everything goes through Apple, and I become distributed by these third parties. The challenge with that is that you become also hostage by these third parties, so you can have no longer control.
And I think your cost structure doesn't really support that.
The current one doesn't, but you could imagine one that does. And I think the sad thing is that you see these new players. I love to talk about Apple Pay and how I prefer to use Apple Pay than to use my card, because I have all my cards in one place. They're very easy to move around. And I realize that I'm no longer thinking about the bank that I'm using when I'm using those things. I'm thinking, okay, that goes to my bank, to my company account, that goes to my personal account, that's on Amex when I get miles, etc., etc. And I'm no longer thinking on the brand. I'm no longer have an affiliation with that specific bank, because I'm not saying I want to use them because I like the brand. I'm using them because they fulfill a need that I have. And that is something that is becoming harder and harder to maintain a control of for the banks.
I was speaking with someone just the other day who was telling me about a company they used to work for that had this kind of internal tagline, which I don't think they use publicly because it may not have necessarily been understood in the right way. But it was...
Do no evil, was it?
It was basically, instead of the concept of customer first, it was staff first. Like, staff first was their mantra. And the concept was, if you treat the staff well, if you create a great internal culture, people are really happy about coming to work, they're happy to work with each other, they're inspired, motivated about what they do, then they're going to reflect that pride in the work they do, the organization they're with, toward the customer. And that's going to create that experience. And there's a lot of the focus, I think, around culture and cultural change is, updating the terms and conditions so they're easier for customers to understand, or not underhandedly selling your customers a bunch of protection insurance that they don't need and all the rest. But maybe it is simply about looking internally and trying to create better working conditions that just have knock-on effects.
Absolutely. And actually, it's really hard to separate the internal from the external because of the role that every single employee plays as an advocate for the organisation. You need people to, in the internal comms game, they call it the pub test. If you're asked down the pub, well, X bank, didn't they do that terrible thing? You need them to know the right kind of message, actually. And you need them to be able to act to customers and to the people that they meet as an advocate for the brand and an ambassador for the brand. And absolutely, if people understand your values, then they are able to live them in practice. So it's absolutely critical in my view.
I think that we can go a step further, at least for some parts of the bank. You have to do better than just have them understand or repeat the right things. You have to have, and not everywhere, right? You're going to have tellers that don't need to understand what fintech is, and they'll still do an amazing job. Or you're going to have, I'm not sure exactly where else it applies, because everyone else that touches technology in any which way needs to up their game in terms of knowledge immediately, needs to really care, intensely care about what they're doing, and needs to feel part of designing a new thing, I think.
And this is where you come across an organisational challenge, that there are parts of organisations that are in conflict with that message. In fact, there's entire technology departments whose raison d'etre is ensuring their own future existence through purchasing of expensive contracts through consultancies. So actually, that if you want people to get on message with digital transformation and organisational transformation, there is a need to focus on culture and in bringing people along on that journey.
We kind of referenced indirectly maybe like the concept of empowerment and like giving your employees like the opportunity to make decisions and feel like they're in control of what they do, that they don't like wear a little name tag with the company logo on it. They actually like represent the company. They are the company, right? It's like it's their company as much as it's anyone else's. So is the traditional hierarchy wrong? Like, is that the wrong model?
I'm not gonna pick this up because there's a humongous conversation that deserves like a few episodes of podcast in itself. Like, is our agile ways of work and the way we reorg organizations around them the end all be all? And they're not, but they are absolutely like a God-given attribute to technology and the way it's going. And if we could use those two things fast enough, we'd be golden in banking, but we can't. Employee empowerment, various types of programs that I've seen work and don't work because you're mandating people to become more empowered. You're not really creating the environment in which they can and they know they have the psychological safety to really go out there and really give you their all. I have something in the program called an entrepreneur school or guide, or it's called the Entrepreneur Warrior Guide, really. And it's literally just making people into, you're going to have to accept you're one of the agents of change in this place, and to make changes, these are the hackathons we can organize. These are the ways you can understand agile working. Just kind of get people to be the banking superheroes, right? That's one method. I don't know if that's the end all be all, but you have to change the base of why you'd be doing that. You can't be doing a remuneration program because you think it's useful. It has to be because you want to motivate people in a different way, and does that work or not? Or is it maybe more about internal passion and what they really get about the industry? So I think there are a lot. All of these existing organizational change things we've been doing in culture are nice things, but I think they're not going to work, and they're going to be way too late for banking if we do that.
I'm somewhat cynical about holacracy working at scale. I don't see many organisations that do get that to work. Hierarchy is useful in some respects, but there's no one set answer for any organisation, because every organisation will have its own purpose, objectives, values, and so on. So it's not really, I don't think any of us could say what the right organisational model for any one organisation is without going in there and deeply understanding how they work. And there's so many factors that affect that, from the international culture that where they base, the language and so on, that can really affect that too. To Duena's point, though, there is a need to better leverage the organisation that you have and the champions that you have in order to make that change happen. So there's all sorts of things that you can do, from identifying change champions to identifying your kind of internal entrepreneurs in order to make that successful change. Okay,
Duena, so you have a number of specific examples, having gone in, talked to banks about the importance of cultural change, proposing some ways in which they can make it happen. And it sounds like it hasn't always worked, or worked to the extent that it could have. Why?
Well, I would not say it hasn't worked whatsoever. I've only just, this thing is hot off the press physically. I started with these organizations in 2015. We've built some of the workshops together. We were really agile. I had a Trello board, in fact, for what did and didn't work, so that we eliminate those bits of the workshops that didn't work. So I think that the tools we have now, in terms of getting people to speak English and have passion and have knowledge, are a lot better and a lot more fine-tuned. And one of the examples I give of how it has worked, the little things that I can tell have changed already, are one of the programs I have is called the Build a Voice program. And that program didn't start with a method. I informally started that program by attempting to create banking superheroes in the bankers I was meeting while I was working with Meniga. And those people, some of those people are still making change in the industry today. Their voices, they're out there, they're like kind of having new propositions that come out of their stuff and themselves. I think that alone is showing that if you get people empowered enough and interested enough, it's gonna really move mountains in banking.
All right, so Alessandro, in your view, why is it that despite this talk for the past, 10 years about culture in banks and how it needs to change and it isn't great and it's, could be better and could improve, profitability and sustainability, why hasn't it happened?
Well, in one word, I think it's legacy. It's legacy issues, and it's not legacy of IT, it's legacy of processes and the way that people present themselves and introduce and think of themselves. Big banks are adamant about saying that they want to have a single customer view and they want to be customer centric. That is very hard to achieve if they are structured in silos that are aligned around product lines. Because every one of those silos has a P&L holder, and that P&L holder is responsible for maximizing his responsibilities. That goes against the customer centric perspective. Because if you're telling me I have to sell these many credit cards to meet my targets, I will try to push credit cards as much as I can in the stores. I would not be thinking about the ultimate need of the customer. I would not be damaging the customer. I would not create a situation where they are in some way mistreated, or a bad outcome comes that is very bad. But they're getting propositions that are driven along the needs and targets that are set along these product silos. That is changing. That has been a traditional method, and people are starting to think about how do I change this model. But it's very, very hard to tell some really senior people that have a very clear P&L and have bonus packages that are aligned with certain performance targets, to tell them that you're no longer be seeing that. So the P&L no longer goes down along the lines of the product, but it goes along the lines of a segment. And the product becomes a cost rather than a cost center rather than a profit center. It's a change of mindset that will find a lot of resistance internally.
So do other companies, other industries outside of banking run things differently? Like, is that why they can have better culture or less cultural baggage?
I love to think about. I love John Lewis, and the whole John Lewis partnership is geared. It's very much an understanding. First of all, there's a question. There's an agreed contract with the customer. The customer knows that they're going to get a decent deal, not necessarily the cheapest rate, but a decent price. Secondly, when I talk to any of their associates that are in the shop floor, they are always either knowledgeable, or they can take me to somebody who is knowledgeable, and that makes me feel confident that they know what they're doing. Thirdly, when you ask for something, they take away themselves from whatever they're doing and they focus on you 100%. So if you ask a waitress person, if you ask him where the cornflakes is, he will not say it's aisle 5. He will take you to aisle 5. Okay, which is a small thing, but it's driven. And all of this is driven by the fact that they have created an ethos where the average individual in that organization feels that they care that the outcome of the customer is good. They have a lot of financial points around it, so there's a profit pool at the end of the year that is shared. The salaries of the senior executives are usually much flatter than comparable roles in other organizations. They have created a way of thinking within the whole from the top to all the way to the bottom of the organization, of the employees of this organization. They want to make sure that the customer gets a fair outcome. So you get returns that are better than any other firm any other competitors. And this is what we need to be thinking about. And they're not thinking about short-term profit. They're thinking about the long-term relationship with the customer. Because a customer that is pissed off because they couldn't return something that broke is not going to come back to you again. And you want to sell that thing endless times in the different generations of customer that come to you.
Is John Lewis a public company?
Is John Lewis
a public company?
It's a partnership.
Yeah.
It's a partnership. What does that mean?
It's either wholly or partly owned by all of its staff, I believe.
I think you're the only English person in the room, so you need
Yeah.
I suppose we Google this real quick.
I could Google that.
Yeah.
I mean, to Alessandro's point, that actually I think the reason that this hasn't taken off in banking is that there's been an over-focus on the technology. And actually, technology is easy. It's people that are hard. And making people change, it requires a lot of effort. And frankly, I don't see many organisations putting that kind of effort in. What's quite interesting as a comparison would be the growth of the government digital service within government in the UK, that they truly transformed the way that they do digital services online. And the way that they did that was a huge focus on organisational change. But I think the critical differentiator here was actually the level of leadership support. So they completely changed the way that they do things, but they did that by setting up a new digital service, bringing in the right people, and having really strong and really visible leadership support for changing the way that they work, and having a huge focus on what the user needs and not how they organize themselves.
I guess that's a really interesting point, and maybe it starts to get to the core of some of this, because really what you're saying is, in a large-scale change situation, it all starts with culture. And I think maybe what we're implicitly saying is that the problem that traditional banks have is that their business models and traditional ways of working are outdated, aren't particularly competitive anymore. There are things that have gotten out of hand, and effectively they're in need of large-scale change. So the reason that culture is so important is to enable them to affect that change. And if culture doesn't come, the change doesn't happen. And
Can I just say, I think I definitely agree with what you're saying. But the thing is, this is not a major problem. It doesn't mean that any big organization has to stop and rethink its culture and recreate it. Its culture changes one step at a time, little thing at a time, exactly. Little incentive at a time. And I think what Duena is trying to do, I think, is identifying, saying, you have a big problem ahead of you, but the longest journey starts with the first step. Take the first step, and then the second, and then the third. And as you're progressing in your journey, you suddenly realize that you have actually achieved this culture change that you wanted by making little changes that may seem irrelevant, cosmetic, small on their own. But when you add them all up, they will take you to a different place. And I think that's what's really exciting about this.
Duena, where can people buy the book?
They can buy it from Amazon, or if we think Amazon already has enough money, they can buy it from Palgrave Macmillan directly from the publisher's website. And I think it just started shipping this week, but they can buy the online version as well.
Great. Well, Duena, Sharon, and Alessandro, thank you very much for your time. It was great to connect.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I suppose I should ask real quick before we jump off. We know where we can buy the book. Sharon and Alessandro, how can people connect with you?
If you visit my company website, it's lithos.partners. That's LITHOS.
And my firm is thepacemakers.net, and it's spelled thepacemakers.net.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.